Uzumaki is a 1998 horror manga written and illustrated by Junji Ito, who is prolific not only where he's based in Japan, but also around the whole world. Uzumaki is likely his best known work, and as you may know, an animated adaptation was recently released. It had been in production for a long time, with its teaser having been released in August of 2019, so it's been a little over 5 years. But was it worth the wait? As of writing this, the final episode just came out. But this will be a primarily visual comparison, so that means you don't have to worry, as I won't be discussing any spoilers. But Uzumaki is still very worth it whether you decide to watch it or read it first. Speaking of, which option is better? Before I answer this question, I should first establish what makes the story itself so good. Uzumaki is a very peculiar story. The title of the manga is a Japanese word that refers to a whirlpool or a spiral. The story is about a small Japanese town that starts to become overtaken by an abstract sort of curse that revolves around spirals. It's a great hook because the spiral is a shape that's vague and simple enough to allow for many different ideas, yet the shape is distinct and intricate enough to allow for an intimate and unsettling exploration of these ideas. The first chapter is one of my favorite works of storytelling ever. It establishes the groundwork and exemplifies the implications of the premise. We see a man whose fascination with spirals is transformed into an obsession. To witness a seemingly ordinary man's descent into utter insanity is pretty upsetting. At first, it puts a minor strain on his family, especially his son Shuichi, who is friends with the protagonist Kiri. Shuichi isn't as surprised as you would expect because he's already picked up on the strange infection taking over the town, and now it's started to affect him personally. The moment the spirals truly overtake Shuichi's father is when he finds them within himself. He had started off by collecting material representations of spirals, but he's truly beyond the point of no return when he represents a spiral. And then, his obsession tragically ends with him killing himself, mutilating his own body into the shape of a spiral. He dies by the spiral just as he had lived by it. This does a great job of laying down a foundation for the rest of the story. This man's death has a major impact on the rest of the characters that are put in focus in other chapters. The second chapter continues this story by showing how it gives Shuichi's mother an intense phobia of spirals, essentially the opposite feelings of her husband, leading to her purging her body of any spiral shape, which ironically leads to her being cursed with a chronic sense of vertigo, at least until her death, leaving Shuichi with no parents, further devastated by the spirals. Now, this is an area that Junji Ito is often criticized for. His characters. They're all pretty one-dimensional, and while that's true for the most part, his storytelling, illustration, and imaginative ideas more than make up for what Uzumaki lacks in character depth. Although, I will make a case for this choice, because having these horrible things happen to ordinary, uninteresting people means that these horrible things could just as easily happen to you and me. It's also part of the thrilling entertainment of John Carpenter's Halloween, and it's what makes that movie remembered as a classic in horror. It's unsettling to see a completely unknown threat targeting random, miscellaneous people. Regardless, I understand why some people would prefer more interesting characters, but at the very least, the ones in Uzumaki get the job done. The protagonist Kiri isn't a character study so much as a point of view to the more dense characters that serve as vessels through which a more important idea is developed. Like with Shuichi's father, it's still not really about his character, it's about a greater evil creating something inhuman. For example, in The Shining, yet another classic in horror, it's not primarily about Jack Torrance's character, it's about the higher power of the Overlook Hotel driving him insane. It's not the only way a character like this can be done, but it's really effective since the point of these particular characters is the higher power rather than the character's personality. While I think this method is best utilized in the first and second chapters, it's also present in most of the other ones. Some of which are still pretty good. Although, in my opinion, most of the stuff that happens after Chapter 3 is just okay. It's not nearly as good. And the story goes a bit off the rails toward the end, but that's not what I want to focus on in this analysis. Instead, I want to talk about how the strengths of the manga hold up in comparison to the show. So let's start by talking about the manga. The manga is timeless. When it comes to Junji Ito's illustrations and his imagination, it's difficult to decide which is more compelling. Both are authentic, and in tandem, they are what make this manga such a chilling experience. There are no traditional horror concepts in Ito's works. All of his ideas are bizarre and abstract, executed with profoundly disturbing visual depictions of body horror. The first chapter I talked about contains some of my favorite illustrations in the manga. For example, in this panel where Shuichi's father shows off that he can procure a spiral from within himself, he begins to stick out his grotesquely long tongue and he impossibly curls it over itself multiple times. This is part of the magic of Junji Ito's imagination. This awful tongue trick is based in plausibility, though it's clearly impossible for a human being to do that. And it can only lead you to think, if his obsession allows him to contort his body to such an extreme, then what could his mind be like? By seeing this, you can rest assured that this is the limit of what self-mutilation his obsession will lead to, right? But it gets so much worse. A bit later on, when Shuichi describes how he and his mother discovered he was dead, he says they found him coiled up around himself, his entire body contorted into a spiral. If his tongue trick seemed impossible, then this is completely absurd. He hardly looks human at this point. As you look deeper into it, you can see that all of these curling shapes follow a continuity. Every part of his body is there, just not exactly in the right place. His hands clasped awkwardly in the middle and his feet stretched around on the outside. Looking at this inspires a horrific question. How could he have possibly done this to himself? They say that it crushed his body, effectively killing him, but no one will ever know how he was able to do it. Now, manga or graphic novels or comics are a very special medium. A few months ago, I looked at No Country for Old Men and how its adaptation from book to movie influenced the presentation of the story, and whether or not the book held up to the movie. There's an important difference there in that Uzumaki originated as a graphic manga series adapted into animation, whereas No Country for Old Men originated as a novel adapted into a live-action film. Now, a novel relies on written word to tell a story primarily by describing thoughts and feelings rather than action, whereas graphic novels walk a middle ground between action and imagination. When you read a novel, you have to rely on your mind's eye to paint you a picture of the scene based on the words, but in a graphic novel, you just have to let the illustrations provide an illusion of motion. But in a sense, graphic novels can be a somewhat underwhelming experience in comparison. In that middle ground, you don't get any voice acting, music, or sound design that you would from a show or a movie, and the only other way to experience the feeling of the story is to have it shown to you. They can't spend an entire page explaining it with words like in a novel, because the words are mostly just dialogue, with the exception of a little bit of narration or internal monologue here and there depending on the story. But what's great about graphic novels is that they're a visual medium that can be done by an individual artist, not requiring rigorous frame-by-frame animation. In my No Country for Old Men video, I brought up a graphic novel called Lucky Penny and explained that if it were adapted into a visual medium, I'd prefer if it were animated. But what I overlooked is that it is a graphic novel while No Country for Old Men is a book. The most common choice of medium when adapting books tends to be live-action film, or sometimes a live-action show. But when you're adapting a graphic novel or a comic, usually you want to be faithful to the illustrations. And animation is the best way to do that. So let's talk about the first episode of the show. Now, the show is a direct adaptation of the manga, none of that live-action movie nonsense. The continuity is actually quite a bit different in the way that it merges different chapters together. In episode 1, chapter 1 and 2 from the manga are the A plot, while chapter 3 and 8 are the B plot. I actually thought this was done really well. The flow is clean and smooth and it allows for the story to be adapted much more efficiently. Having read the manga, the pacing felt a little fast, which makes sense given how much of the story they're putting into a single 20-minute episode. But it's not really a big deal, and probably not something an ordinary viewer would notice. I'm honestly really impressed how seamlessly they were able to slot these different stories between each other. Now, the first episode is really good. I really like the way they portrayed the story from the manga, but what about the visuals? How did Junji Ito's iconic illustrations translate into animation? First, we see Kiri walking down a path overlooking the town, just like in the manga. I really like the way they adapt the movement of this scene into animation. For example, in the manga, in this panel, she's holding her bag to her side, and in the next panel, she's holding it in front. In the animation, this scene starts off with her holding it to the side, and in the next, we get to see her move it in front. It's just a small thing, but it's very satisfying to see. Then there's the intro sequence, and I'd like to take a second to appreciate it. First of all, I really like the music choice. It's creepy and it has a lot of impact. And then there's this very clever title card. At first it just looks like a spiral background for the opening credits, but as it goes on, the spiral reorients itself into the title card. As an editor, I love this. It's simple but creative, and it's just a really nice touch. After that, we see the major strengths of this adaptation. They've brought Junji Ito's art style to life in such a brilliant and mind-blowing way. First of all, they've kept it black and white, and that was absolutely the best way to go. Now, a lot of manga is in black and white as well, and most of them are animated into color, but for Uzumaki and Junji Ito's art style in general, part of the beauty is in what he achieves with just 2 colors. Not only was it the safest bet, I think it was very important for them to remain faithful in that regard. Now, the art style itself is slightly different. Compared to the manga, it looks very clean and well-rounded, especially with the characters. That's not to say that the manga art style is sloppy, but it is somewhat crude in the crosshatch shading, which feels very natural. Specifically for an animation, I think consistency works much better. As unique as it is, Junji Ito's art style is not unadaptable. This show proves that. It's just that this is the first time it's been adapted into the right medium. So let's look at some more examples. We'll start with this one.
ろくろによる作刀とはいわば渦巻きの芸術ですな。私に一つ作ってくれませんか。特別目の回りそうな皿を一枚。皿の表には渦巻き模様を描いてください。ガゲレゲレと、そうですな。黒い渦巻きがいいですな。
I really like this scene. Shuichi's father is visiting Kiri's father, asking him for a custom piece of pottery with a spiral design. It plays out pretty much identically to the way it does in the manga, and it's brought to life so perfectly. Like I mentioned, the animation looks phenomenal, and that holds true in this scene as well, but something that jumps out to me is the audio. The voice acting is really good. This man sounds genuinely insane. Just listen to him cackle about his spirals. The other thing I really appreciate about the audio is the sound design. Just that subtle droning hum following his finger movement creates a really strong atmosphere. Another example of the great sound design is in this scene. You can just feel how threatening this aura is. It feels almost like staring into a deep chasm in the dark. Anything within would be completely unknown. Again, it's just a subtle synth, but the atmosphere is so creepy. For atmosphere, however, I think this scene is the strongest example. It's the scene from the manga that I brought up earlier, wherein Shuichi's father is found dead. The tension here is very immersive. This is what it would feel like to get home and find something so horrible. I think it's honestly more effective than the same scene in the manga. The emotions are so much more vivid with audio and distinct motion. This was my favorite scene from the episode. Overall, I think that this adaptation in the first episode was done incredibly well. It looks absolutely stunning in the way that it brings Junji Ito's horrific art style into animation, and it flows very well in the way that it merges multiple different chapters into one episode. To be completely honest, this is the greatest work of animation I've ever seen. I was so impressed by what they did with the first episode. The first episode. Now, for the other episodes, well, I'm afraid I can't say the same. The second episode is just okay. It's a little all over the place, but to be fair, the first episode already used up the best material that existed in the manga. Like I mentioned earlier, after the first 3 chapters of the manga, it just starts getting kinda repetitive. So in comparison, it's understandable why the second episode isn't quite as magical. Now, episode 3, it's pretty good. I like the way they tied up the story of Shuichi's mother from episode 1, and I thought it was clever how they used the hospital setting to mix that story with the hospital setting in chapter 10 in the manga. But it's here that we really start noticing substantially less quality in the animation. After the first episode, it doesn't look nearly as good. And it's even worse in the 4th and final episode. We see less elaborate shading and line work in scenes that should have more impact. A few shots still look pretty nice, but for the most part, the animation just doesn't look that good compared to the first episode. Now, like I said earlier, the story goes off the rails toward the end, and since that's already a complaint I have with the manga, it doesn't make me feel any different about the show. The only real complaints I have with it are in the visuals. The animation in the first episode was very promising, and I think the way it looks after that is a really big letdown. Does Uzumaki work better as a show? Unfortunately, no, I don't think it does. If the whole show had maintained the quality found in the first episode, then I probably would have preferred the show. But based on what we've been given, it just doesn't hold up. Which is really disappointing because I thought that the first episode was incredible. That alone makes me at the very least happy with how the series turned out. But still, I think the manga is superior. So, that's another one of these videos, and I suppose that means that this is now a series. I really enjoyed making the first one, and I really enjoyed making this one as well. So expect to see more videos like this in the future, as well as whatever else I decide to make. Right now, I'm honestly pretty short on ideas, but don't worry about that. I just need to find some inspiration, and I don't doubt I will. I have been here before. Alongside my normal form of videos, I would also like to make some more short form stuff, but that won't interfere with anything. So thanks for watching, and thanks for listening to me blab on for a moment. And I will return.